Napoleon did a quick head count, disregarding the paper figures, which showed the convention with 6 deadly fusillade, mowing down the insurgents in droves. This was the action he later euphemistically called the whiff of grape shot. Meanwhile, the guns he had positioned to command the Seine prevented the rebels on the left bank from crossing over to aid their comrades. By 6 p.m. these two fell back discomfited, and both horns of the intended attack withdrew. That night the rain pelted down again, washing away the gore of an urban battlefield. There were 400 corpses inside St. Roch Church and another 1,000 bodies lay dead on the streets. Next day Barras and his henchmen left the gates of Paris open so that the surviving rebels could escape. Barras informed the government that Napoleon was the hero of the hour, and must be promoted to Major General, but his colleagues in the Directory claimed to be incredulous that this General Bonaparte, still an unknown, had played any part in the victory. A week later Barras resigned his post as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior, and recommended Napoleon as his successor. The story was that Barras told his colleagues, "Promote this man or he will promote himself without you." Over great opposition, particularly from Carnot, Napoleon was named as the new commander. He was to receive an annual salary of 48,000 francs and would have the de facto position of governor of Paris, as well as controlling the police and secret service. At 26, Napoleon was rich and famous. In euphoria he wrote to Joseph that he would now be able to enrich the Bonaparte clan with places and perquisites. The process began at once. Laetitia received 6,000 francs and, with her daughters, relocated from the wretched garret in Marseille to the best apartment in the plushest house in the city's most sought-after quarter. Joseph was made consul in Italy and given money to invest in Genoese privateers, while Lucien was appointed commissary with the Army of the North in the Netherlands. Louis was promoted lieutenant in the 4th Artillery Regiment and joined Napoleon's staff as military secretary and aide-de-camp. The 11-year-old Jerome was sent to an expensive Irish school near Paris, where Napoleon, mindful of his own schooldays at Brienne, spoiled him outrageously and loaded him with pocket money. Fesch, the financial brains of the Bonaparte clan, temporarily left the priesthood for the lucrative post of commissary to the Army of Italy. To Madame Clary Napoleon sent a de haut en bas note informing her of his new status, ostensibly for the purpose of introducing his henchman Stanislas Fréron, but to Désirée he wrote not a word. To Joseph he wrote on the 15th of November, clearly reveling in his new status as a man of wealth, "I have just received 400,000 francs for you. I have given it to Fesch who will pay it into your account. I may install the family here. Let me have much more news of you and your wife and of Désirée. Goodbye, my good friend, I am all yours. My only worry is the knowledge that you are so far away and to be deprived of your company. Were not your wife pregnant, I would try to persuade you to come and spend some time in Paris." For the first time since Toulon, Napoleon was unquestionably on the winning side, and he reveled in his new status. His letters now bespeak a confidence that he was born under a lucky star. He moved at once from his dingy quarters in the Marais to a splendid new house. The man who just a few days before was destitute now drove around Paris in a fine carriage, invited guests to a private box at the opera, and gave lush parties at his headquarters in the Place Vendôme. If Napoleon had been unknown to the wider public before Vendémiaire, now he was a household name. Fréron's extravagant praise, during a session of the convention on October, saw to that, even if the frightful Fréron had an ulterior motive, since he was slavering with lust at the thought of the stunning 15-year-old Pauline Bonaparte, and had plans to marry her. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior, Napoleon was responsible for internal order and for tranquility in Paris, that notorious powder keg. Since the economic crisis showed no signs of abating, he began by striking at the most likely focus of discontent. He closed the Pantheon Club, the nerve center of the Jacobin party. With 40,000 men at his disposal, he divided them into cohorts and heavily policed potential trouble spots, with an ostentatious display of showing the flag. The pressing problem, as always, was the Parisian bread supply. Throughout these years the search for real bread, made from white flour, sold at reasonable prices was the abiding concern of the proletariat. Napoleon liked to tell a story, probably apocryphal, of a menacing situation that developed when would-be bread rioters surrounded a platoon he was commanding. A monstrously fat woman jeered at the soldiers and tried to work up the crowd by calling out that the military grew fat while the poor starved. Napoleon was at this time extremely thin, and called out, "My good woman, look carefully at me. Which of us is the fatter?" The contrast in profiles was too much. All tension dissolved in gales of laughter. October 795 was the great turning point in Napoleon's life, for, immediately after the Vendémiaire triumph, he became heavily involved in an affair with Rose de Beauharnais which led to marriage. The two events should be seen as cause and effect, not coincidence, as in the versions of some credulous biographers. The usual story is that after 13 Vendémiaire Napoleon issued a decree that Parisians should hand in all weapons. In the light of this decree, Rose de de Beauharnais' 14-year-old son, Eugene, went to see Napoleon to ask him if he could keep his father's ceremonial sword, which had been bequeathed him. Napoleon agreed. Rose called to thank him, and the affair took off from there. This is obvious legend. Rose de Beauharnais was their Italian's best friend, and Napoleon would have seen her many times at the gatherings at La Chaumière. But then he was nothing, and would not have excited her interest. After Vendémiaire he was a rising star. The fable about Eugene was invented later to save face on both sides. Rose wanted to conceal the fact that she had set her cap at the young general, while Bonaparte wanted to rewrite the historical fact that he had been Barras's creature, and that it was Barras who suggested the liaison. If we discount the transparent story about the sword, what is left is the historical fact that on the 15th of October Napoleon made his first visit to her house in the Rue de Chantereine. Who was this Rose de Beauharnais, who would be known to history and legend as Josephine? She was born on the 23rd of June 1763 in the French colony of Martinique in the West Indies, and christened Marie-Joseph Rose. Her father was the struggling plantation owner Joseph Tascher de Iapadrie. At 16, despite being in love with the son of a Scots Jacobite emigre, she had been sent to France to wed Alexander de Beauharnais in a marriage arranged by her aunt, who was the mistress of the bridegroom's father. Rose's marriage was turbulent, and in the first 4 years Alexander spent just 10 months with her, long enough to beget a son, Eugene, born in 1781. When she was pregnant with a second child, Alexander decided to visit Martinique and departed with a former mistress, Laura de Longpre. The jealous Laura poisoned his mind against Rose and, once in Martinique, bribed and threatened the Iapadrie slaves to say that Rose had led a promiscuous life before she left for France. In letters to Rose full of bitterness, Alexander repudiated the paternity of Hortense. When he returned to France, he abducted Eugene, but was forced to give him up. During the separation that followed, Rose seems to have undergone a change of personality, for it is in these years that the sensual, pleasure-loving, promiscuous woman first emerges. In 1788 Rose took Hortense with her to Martinique on a transatlantic voyage that no one has explained satisfactorily. Some say she was pregnant when she boarded ship and certainly not by her husband. A possible abortion on board ship could explain her later childlessness. At all events, Rose stayed in Martinique for 2 years. In 1790 she returned to Paris where, though still separated, she was on reasonable terms with Alexander de Beauharnais. During the Revolution the ex-oligarch de Beauharnais moved ever leftwards until he was one of the Mountain faction. However, he was caught up in the collective madness of the Terror, where one species of Jacobin shark ate another. Falling foul of Robespierre and Saint-Just, he was imprisoned in the notorious Les Carmes prison in April 1794. For petitioning for his release, Rose suffered the same fate. In Les Carmes, which had the reputation of being a gigantic brothel, where the soon-toady coupled frenziedly to thumb their noses at the guillotine, Alexander de Beauharnais was having an affair with Delphine de Custine. Rose, who had turned to casual liaisons after her return to Paris in 1790, took General Hoche as her lover. In prison there was an amazing camaraderie of the damned. Once they had locked their charges securely inside the prison, the warders were indifferent what they got up to. The result was a kind of combination of perpetual orgy with social club for the doomed. Among women friends Rose made in jail were Grace Dalrymple and there's Italian. Alexander de Beauharnais was taken out for execution on the 22nd of July, just 5 days before Robespierre's downfall in the Thermidorian coup. 10 days after the coup Rose herself was at liberty. Attaching herself to there's Italian and the Chaumière set, she became Barras's mistress and lived a life of luxury totally at odds with her private financial situation, which was desperate. This trait seems to have been a cultural legacy of Martinique where insolvent plantation families indulged in conspicuous consumption to overawe their slaves. Apart from her relentless frivolity, she never read a book but spent a fortune on clothes. Rose most impressed her contemporaries by her sexual appetite. When she came out of prison and found that Hoche had not, after all, been guillotined, she tried to resume her affair with him. Hoche admitted that she was wonderful in bed but, alongside his desire for her, was disgusted by her voracious appetite. He snubbed her with the words, "Such an amour can be pardoned in a prison but hardly outside. One may take a prostitute for a mistress but hardly for a wife," according to Barras's later testimony. But it must be remembered that by this time he hated both Napoleon and Josephine and spewed out malicious rumor. Hoche was disposed to resume the affair until he found the lecherous Rose in the arms of his giant Alsatian groom named Van Acker. The cynical libertine Barras, however, cared nothing about the background of the women in his informal harem and was happy to add Rose to his collection. The friendship between Rose and there's Italian, 10 years her junior, was celebrated. They often wore identical clothes to establish the rapport. Both were generous and compassionate women. Both had been married young to unsuitable men and both had been imprisoned during the Terror and come close to the guillotine. From the sexual point of view, the most intriguing similarity was that they were both mistresses of Barras, who in his memoirs left a devastating comparison of the lubricious charms of each. Barras claimed that Derja was a genuinely passionate woman, but that behind Rose's pretended ecstasies in the bedchamber was a calculating machine, mentally clocking up francs and livers. But other memoirs contradict this. The consensus is that Josephine was a woman of genuinely high sex drive, only this side of nymphomania, and that Barras's testimony is unreliable for obvious reasons. Such was the 32-year-old woman with whom Napoleon became involved in October 795, not really pretty, past the bloom of youth, with no outstandingly good features and with teeth so bad and blackened that she had trained herself to smile without showing them. Rose de Beauharnais was at best a jolie aide. Some descriptions make her sound like a Southern belle of the pre-American Civil War type. She had fine, silky, chestnut hair, magnetic dark blue eyes and long lashes. She had trained herself to be sexy, hence the sweet smile, the graceful walk and the husky, drawling voice which she tried to render mellifluous. She made the best of a good skin tone by dressing elegantly, surrounding herself with jewels and flowers. At first the affair with Napoleon was little more than flirtation. On the 28th of October she wrote to him, "You no longer come to see a girlfriend who loves you. You are wrong, for she is tenderly attached to you. Come tomorrow to dine with me. I need to see you and talk about your interests." Napoleon replied at once, "I cannot imagine the reason for the tone of your letter. I beg you to believe that no one desires your friendship as much as I do. No one could be more eager to prove it. Had my duties permitted, I would have come in person to deliver this message." From the 29th of October Napoleon spent every night for 5 months with Josephine. For the first few days contact was restricted to dining, but early in November the affair was consummated. The morning after they first made love, Napoleon wrote to her, fixing her for all time as Josephine, 7 in the morning. "I awaken full of you. The memory of yesterday's intoxicating evening has left no rest to my senses. Sweet and incomparable Josephine, I draw from your lips, from your heart, a flame which consumes me. 1,000 kisses, but do not give me any, for they burn my blood." Josephine had set out quite cynically and calculatedly to snare Napoleon. She needed a powerful protector and she needed money, and General Bonaparte seemed to fit the bill under both heads. There are hints that Barras was becoming tired of her and thought that an ingenious solution would be to get rid of her onto Napoleon, so that his two protégés would be bound to each other by sex and to him by gratitude. Yet it was Josephine who took the decision, and the deciding factor seems to have been her old lover Lazare Hoche. Having defeated the Vendée rebels, Hoche returned to Paris to take over command of the projected invasion of Ireland, the one which came within an ace of success in 1796. Reluctant to return to his wife in Lorraine, Hoche stayed on in Paris, apparently having regrets about his intemperate outburst to Josephine the year before. He did not mind sharing her with the powerful Barras, but he was angry to find the very general who had refused to serve under him not only his superior in rank but installed in the Rue Chantereine as her lover. Josephine, it seems, would have been willing to take Hoche back, but two things worked against this. First, she made a false move by telling him she would use all her arts and influence to get him a top command. Hoche, however, was a proud man who was determined to achieve his ambitions on his own merits, and not through the machinations of a woman. Second, word came through that his wife had given birth to a daughter. On the 3rd of January 1796 Hoche reluctantly left Paris. He later rationalized with bitterness his failure to get Josephine back and wrote to a friend, "I have asked Mme Bonaparte to return my letters. I did not wish her husband to read my love letters to that woman, who I despise." Once it became clear that she could never become Madame Barras, Josephine decided her interests were best served by marriage to Napoleon, but there were a few early hiccups in the relationship. Apparently each of the lovers thought the other had money. Josephine begged Barras not to tell Bonaparte the true situation. There was one contretemps before the marriage when Napoleon visited her lawyer to inquire about her allegedly extensive property in Martinique. The mixture of panic and anger drew from her a stern reproof which brought him to heel, for he hastened to reassure her that he was no fortune hunter. "You thought I did not love you for yourself alone." Many of Josephine's friends thought that Napoleon was a strange choice for her. Their personalities clashed, as she was indolent while he was violent and passionate. He was not really a man of sufficient means, as he had no old money, had a numerous family to support and could end up penniless if the wheel of fortune turned once more. Her lawyer, Ragudo, warned her that she was on shifting sands. "Can you be so foolish as to marry a young man who has nothing but his cloak and his sword?" Others of her friends pointed out that Bonaparte was physically unappealing, and, the most obvious objection of all, that she neither loved him nor was in love with him. Josephine weighed all this, but against the minuses were some powerful pluses. Her own charms were fading fast, and the supply of influential admirers would sooner or later dry up. She felt she had a hold over Napoleon, which she never had over Beres, and only fleetingly with Hoch. Also, Bonaparte had the makings of an excellent stepfather, and Eugene, in particular, needed a male guardian he could look up to. During the Terror, when it was mandatory for all children to learn a trade, he had been apprenticed to a carpenter. Then he had spent a year as Hake's orderly in the Vendée and had witnessed terrible atrocities. Josephine felt that her son had seen too much of the seamy side of life too soon, and hoped that he would be wrapped thereafter in Napoleon's mantle. It was true that her daughter Hortense did not appear to care for her prospective stepfather, but time could cure that. Whether Josephine's estimate of Hortense's feelings was accurate is a moot point. In her memoirs, Hortense speaks of being overwhelmed by Napoleon's intellect and exhausted by his energy. She recalled a dinner with Beres at the Luxembourg on the 21st of January 1796, when she sat between her mother and Bonaparte, and he seemed besotted with Josephine, as an emotionally draining experience. On the 7th of February 1796, the marriage banns between Napoleon and Josephine were announced, and on the 9th of March the wedding took place, but not before Napoleon had kept the bride waiting 3 hours. Beres, Tallien and her lawyer acted as the witnesses on Josephine's side, and an 18-year-old army captain, Le Marois, played the role for Napoleon. Although Napoleon was 26 and Josephine rising 33, they both declared themselves to be 28. According to the marriage certificate, Josephine had been born in 1767, and Napoleon in 1768. This was not the only false aspect of a somewhat sordid marriage ceremony. Josephine had cynically opted for a civil ceremony to make divorce easier, but in fact there is doubt that the couple had been legally married at all. The mayor was not present, possibly because of the wedding's extreme lateness, and the ceremony was conducted by his assistant, who had no legal authority to do so. Moreover, as a minor, Le Marois could not legally be a witness. To cap all, Josephine had continued her affair with Beres right up to the eve of her wedding, showing the shape of things to come. The honeymoon itself was scarcely auspicious. First, Josephine's dog Fortune, whom she insisted on having in bed with her, bit Napoleon, whether or not in flagrante is not recorded. Napoleon turned in his usual perfunctory love-making performance, said to be so rapid it came close to being ejaculatio precox. Josephine, frustrated by this expeditious approach to intercourse, took to telling her close friends that Bonaparte was bon urine. A week earlier, Beres's wedding present had been made official, Napoleon's nomination as commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy. The background to this was Napoleon's abiding obsession that the key to victory over Austria lay in Italy. While commander of the Army of the Interior, he continued to bombard the Directory with criticisms of the conduct of the war on the Italian front. Increasingly, an undeclared struggle for power took place between Napoleon in Paris and General Scherer in Nice. Scherer, more and more irritated at Napoleon's sniping, complained to the Directory that its boy wonder's plans were chimerical and quixotic. After getting his way a couple of times by threatening to resign unless the Directory backed him, Scherer finally overplayed his hand, and the Directory accepted his resignation, effective the 2nd of March 1796. But when Napoleon was appointed in his stead, the Parisian press reacted hostilely, alleging that Beres had rewarded one of his favorites because he feared generals of real talent. Hoch, Moreau, Marceau and Pichegru were mentioned in this category. Once he had decided to marry Josephine, Napoleon's first task was to get out of his engagement with Désirée. As soon as the thought of marriage entered his mind, he started distancing himself from Désirée. The ending of a letter to Joseph in November is eloquent. He merely sent his regards to Désirée, no longer referring to her as Eugenie. Once his mind was definitely made up, in January 1796, he informed Désirée that unless she got the consent of her family immediately, they must end their engagement. This was Machiavellian, for he knew perfectly well that Madame Clary opposed the match on grounds of her daughter's youth, and would withhold her consent while she was still a minor. The next Désirée knew was the announcement that her beloved was married. There is no need to doubt the sincerity of the heartbroken letter she sent Napoleon. "You have made me so unhappy, and I am weak enough to forgive you. You married. Poor Désirée must no longer love you or think of you. My one consolation is that you will know how steadfast I am. I have nothing more to hope for but death. Life is a torment to me, since I may no longer dedicate it to you. You married. I cannot grasp the thought, it kills me. Never shall I belong to another, and I had so hoped soon to be the happiest of women. Your wife. Your marriage has shattered my happiness. All the same, I wish you the greatest joy and blessing in your marriage. May the woman you have chosen make you as happy as I had intended to make you and as happy as you deserve to be. In the midst of your present happiness, do not quite forget poor Eugenie, and be sorry for her fate." What possessed Napoleon to marry a penniless Creole, 6 years his elder and with fading looks? There can be many answers, ranging from the banal to the pathological. At the simplest level, it can be argued that Napoleon anchored himself to the ruling elite by this marriage to one of its leading female icons. Some have gone so far as to say say that Barras forced him to marry Josephine as a quid pro quo for the supreme command in Italy, but this view hinges on the mistaken idea that Napoleon had no relationship with Barras before Josephine. In fact, he was a firm favorite long before Rose de Beauharnais ever featured in his life. An alternative view is that Napoleon was naive, thought Josephine was of higher rank than she was, and imagined that he had married into the aristocracy. It is true that in a letter to Joseph he described the Chaumière circle as the most distinguished society in Paris, and if we incline to this view, Napoleon would emerge as a victim of snobbery, imagining that he now had entree into royalist and aristocratic circles. Marmont thought this was the explanation and wrote in his memoirs, Napoleon almost certainly believed at the time that he had taken a greater step upwards than ever he felt when he married the daughter of the Caesars, but all this makes the match a marriage of convenience, and it was never that. Napoleon himself, aware that he had lost his head over Josephine, tried to rewrite this episode on Saint Helena, as he rewrote all the others in his life, and insinuated that reason of state was involved. Perhaps he hated himself for the one spontaneous, unmeditated action of his life. What decisively refutes the idea of marriage of convenience is Napoleon's sexual besottedness with Josephine, for which the evidence is overwhelming. She had the prettiest little cunt in the world, the trois islets of Martinique were there, is one of many expressions of his appreciation of her physical charms. Besides, Josephine was exactly the kind of woman who was likely to appeal to a man who was sexually insecure and misogynistic. She was unchallenging, feather-brained, feminine in all the traditional ways. She was luxury-loving, obsessed with clothes and makeup, hopeless with money. She spoke in a little girl voice, lied transparently, and could burst into tears apparently at will. Napoleon's own judgment is interesting. She was a woman to her fingertips. I really did love her, but I had no respect for her. But what is often overlooked or forgotten by students of this ill-matched pair, and analysts of this improbable marriage, is that after Vendémiaire, Napoleon could have had almost any woman in Paris. So why this one? Why a woman of mediocre looks and fading beauty? Some have speculated that Napoleon was sexually inexperienced, and needed the reassurance of an older woman well versed in the arts of love. His own words are often quoted, "I was not insensible to women's charms, but I had hardly been spoiled by them. I was shy with them. Madame Bonaparte was the first to give me confidence." That could be construed as referring to lack of sexual confidence, but it suggests more strongly a man in need of maternal feelings and training in social graces and savoir-faire. It is by no means so clear that Napoleon was the sexual novice this theory requires him to be. The Bonaparte clan were united in their dislike of Josephine. Lucian referred to her contemptuously as an aging Creole, and Letizia in particular, who had wanted her son to marry Désirée, always hated Josephine. The conventional view is that Letizia was enraged that Josephine was of higher rank than she, that she had a chip on her shoulder accordingly, and that her charming letter of friendship to her daughter-in-law masked a vengeful fury. The shrewdest critics have seen that Letizia is important to this story in a quite different sense. Dorothy Carrington wrote, "Was his marriage to Josephine, who combined all the traits of character Letizia deplored, his masterpiece against the adored mother who had deceived him. There are two aspects of Josephine that strike observers who have only the most cursory knowledge of her. She was an older woman, and she was habitually unfaithful. If we accept that Napoleon had a complex about Letizia, then it is interesting to note what C.G. Jung has to say about the mother complex in general. If a young man loves a woman who could almost be his mother, then it always has to do with a mother complex. Such a union is sometimes quite fruitful for many years, particularly in the case of artistic persons who have not fully matured. The woman in such a case is helped by an almost biological instinct. She is hatching eggs. The man is the son lover benefits by the partially sexual, partially mother interest of the woman. Thus such a relationship can be satisfactory in every respect for an indefinite period, but the advancing years would certainly put a definite limit to it, as it is not quite natural. It may even be that an artistic nature becomes so adult that the need of becoming a father, and a grown-up man in general, begins to prevail against the original son attitude. When that is the case, the relationship is overdue. Jung's formulation by no means covers all aspects of the Napoleon-Josephine relationship. Josephine was only 6 years older than her husband. He himself, though a genius, was scarcely an artistic person, and it was not really the maturing of Napoleon that brought the relationship to an end. But Jung does convey the important insight that a relationship with a significantly older woman may show that the mother is lurking in the male unconscious. Freud suggested that Napoleon's complex about Joseph was why he insisted on renaming Rose de Beauharnais Josephine. But it seems more plausible to assume that the deep dynamic in this case focused on Napoleon's unconscious feelings about Letizia rather than Joseph. It has sometimes been suggested that Napoleon was so naive about Josephine that he knew nothing of her checkered past, and was thus astonished when he was first cuckolded. Theories about Napoleon's alleged navy seldom convince. He was always exceptionally well informed, and as soon as he had a whiff of power employed a host of spies and secret agents. Of course Napoleon reacted with anger to slights to his pride and honor caused by his wife's infidelity, but at the unconscious level it was what he expected. His ambivalent emotions about Letizia and his love for his mother alongside the certainty that she had been unfaithful to his father could coexist without conflict in the unconscious, but at the conscious level had to be displaced onto other women. Hence his contemptuous and discourteous behavior later when he had a court of his own. But most of all, he needed to find a woman who was at once entirely dissimilar to Letizia yet at root the same kind of female. In taking an older and promiscuous woman as his wife, Napoleon showed himself to be enthralled to a peculiar mother complex. His mother, the object of his unintegrated emotion, was also someone he loved but did not respect, and the principal reason was her infidelity. This is undoubtedly the most profound reason why he opted for Josephine rather than Desiree. As a young girl who was almost religiously faithful to him during his long absence in Paris, Desiree did not have the attributes required. Josephine, the unfaithful mother, on the other hand, satisfied all the deep drives in the Napoleonic unconscious.